All right, good afternoon or good morning, evening, whenever you may be watching this. My name is Jacob Babb, and I'm a Global Learning Advisor in the Department of Global Learning in the Office of International Programs. And this speaker series talk is being given to us by Jackie Logsdon, and she actually is part of the International Center here at WSU, and she is going to be giving a talk called Culture and Media in Cuba. And she's going to have a little bit of a perspective taking theme to it. And yeah, Jackie, you can take it away.
Awesome. So like Jacob said, I graduated from the Murrow College a few years ago. I'm a graduate student again there now. And I did a study abroad in Cuba a few years ago. So I'm just going to chat about that for a minute. Let me share my screen and pull up the presentation. And all right. Whoops. Decided to start a few slides in. Okay. So I studied abroad in Havana, Cuba in 2015 over the summer. It was a faculty-led program, so that's why it was so short. If you do choose to study abroad, the shorter options are there for if you're like me and you don't want to spend, an entire 6 months away from home. The focus of the class was on journalism and media in Cuba. So we went down there to actually film our own journalism stories. So just a little thing to get us started. If you ever do manage to go to Cuba, welcome mojitos are very much a thing. Everywhere we went, there was always a mojito waiting for us. I personally don't like mojitos very much, so this wasn't great for me, but everyone else loved them. So if you're a fan of minty drinks, Cuba has got you 100% covered. This is a picture of the courtyard out in front of where we stayed. So that building on the left there was actually our hotel. There's a lot of really old, very colonial looking architecture in Cuba, and that's a direct result of obviously the colonization of Cuba by Europeans. So you'll see a lot of this type of architecture there, kind of similar to maybe some of the stuff you might see on the very, very eastern coast of the United States. And Cuba is beautiful by night. You'll notice this is a nighttime picture. Everything is just lit up in beautiful shades of yellow. Doesn't want to go. Okay, sorry about that. I think my computer froze for a second. But anyway, Cuba, as you probably know, is not an easy place to actually get to. You can't just, with a US passport, you can't just roll up to Cuba for a vacation. It's very difficult to get there. The reason for that is because Cuba is currently on a list that the United States has, and that is a list of the state sponsors of terrorism. So basically what that means is the United States does not want to in any way help the Cuban economy. And obviously tourism is a big boost for economies where lots of tourists show up. So the United States does not allow US citizens to just go vacation in Cuba for fun. It is not Cuba that doesn't want people to come, it's the US that doesn't want people to go. So while we were down there, we saw plenty of Canadians and people from other countries. It's just that the US government really doesn't want people to go to Cuba. The only way that we were able to go, this was back in 2015, was via a special deal that WSU has with the US government, where we were allowed to send educational groups down to Cuba. So we were allowed to do a study abroad down there. And there's a whole bunch of paperwork and stuff to go through to be able to get that go ahead. I forget exactly how many schools have that permission, but it's not a lot. So it's relatively rare for a school to have a study abroad in Cuba compared with other countries because of how difficult it is to do. Because of this, we did have to, not really lie, but we did have to maybe, be a little creative with how we worded some of the things that we were doing down there. We had to submit our itineraries beforehand, and we had to make sure that there were plenty of museum tours and newspaper tours and very, very educational things. And on the days that we took off to go hang out at the beach, maybe don't put that on the list because they'll raise an eyebrow or two. So this was all happening during a time known as the Cuban Thaw, and that was mid 2010s when they were starting to get a little bit more lax about letting different universities and businesses go down to Cuba for things. So back in the mid 2000s, it kind of looked for a while like relations between the US and Cuba were going to maybe kind of go towards getting repaired. Maybe we were going to establish some business relations, maybe some economic relations. That's all kind of been put on the back burner now. Most of that progress has stalled, but during this time it was known as the Cuban Thaw. Embargo versus blockade, I put that up there because this is one of those things where depending on where you go, it will be described in different ways. Obviously, an embargo is different from a blockade. A blockade is when one country or entity is essentially trying to stop another country from doing a lot of trading. And that is more like what is happening between the US and Cuba. The US will not play nicely with places that trade with Cuba. But the US will call it an embargo. Cuba calls it a blockade. So when we went down there, that was one of the first things that we heard, was that everybody referred to it as the blockade, not as the embargo, which was the language that we were used to here in the United States. The US does have restrictions and foreign sanctions against Cuba, again, to kind of to try to make sure that the US is doing everything that it can to not help the government of Cuba. An interesting little aside, if you ever do go to Cuba, you have to be very careful when you're exchanging money. So in Cuba, they have two types of currency. They have Cougs, which is the currency that you use as a tourist down there. And the Coug is roughly a 1-to-1 ratio with like the US dollar. It's pretty close. But they also have Cuban pesos, and that's the money that the government and the people of Cuba use. And that's the money that normally a US dollar would be worth a lot of Cuban pesos. But when you actually go to Cuba, they don't let you spend pesos. They don't let you have pesos if you're not Cuban. So just because you're going to Cuba doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get everything for really super cheap, because they have those two currencies down there. When we went there, what we had to do was, because nowhere in the US will they exchange US dollars for Cuban money, we had to exchange our US money for Canadian money. And then when we got to Cuba, we exchanged the Canadian money for the Cuban money. And this worked, for most of us. There were 1 or 2 people in my group who made the mistake of telling their banks what they were going to do with the US to Canadian money that they were transferring. They made the mistake of saying, we're going to take this Canadian money down to Cuba and turn it into Cuban money. And their banks actually refused to do the transaction for them because they were so worried that the US government would sue them for essentially aiding and abetting the Cuban economy. And whether or not that would have actually happened, I don't know. I think those banks may have been overreacting or just been very scared, but my point is that they were really nervous about doing any sort of business, even remotely attached to Cuba. So that was a fun incident. And when you go to Cuba, it's charter plane only, obviously. There's no flight from the US to Cuba that's on like a normal airline route. So when you got to Florida, we had to take a special charter plane from the Florida International Airport down into Havana. And I don't know if you've ever had to use a charter plane before, but they do not care about your schedule and when your flights are leaving or landing. They're not officially connected to your flight route. So we ran into a lot of trouble with just trying to get there because the charter planes would be late or delayed. And normally if your flight is late or delayed, the airline will kind of automatically fix whatever it needs to fix with your remaining flights to make sure you get someplace on time. That does not happen with charter planes. If your charter plane is late, you just have to buy a new ticket because the airline, they do not care. We actually got to sit in on the very first talks between several US airlines and the Cuban government on our first night in Havana. It was the first event that we sat in on, was a discussion over perhaps opening up some flights between the US and Cuba. Because again, at this time, about 5 years ago, there were some serious talks going on about making it easier for people to go to Cuba just, for fun or, to visit family or for business. The United States interest section, the last item on my list there, was an interesting adventure. So there's no official embassy in Cuba, or there was not in 2015. However, there was a United States interest section, and it was essentially the US Embassy. And the first thing they told us when they got there was, pretend this is the US Embassy. We're not allowed to officially have one, but this is the US Embassy in Havana. And over here is just a beautiful background picture of Cuba. It's a very warm, tropical, very humid place. I got sick the first day I was there, even though I was not overdressed and I was drinking plenty of water. It is just very different from if you come from an arid, dry area like Pullman. It's a bit of a shock. Oh yeah, so this is what I was talking about a moment ago. So the first official commercial flight in about 50 years between the US and Cuba was in 2016, when they were just starting to try to do this. And our first day there, we got to sit in on the negotiations for this. It was very intimidating because in order to get into the US interest section, you have to walk through essentially a gauntlet of Cuban military officials, all armed with their rifles, which is possibly the most intimidating thing I've ever had to do, was walk through that line of very, very heavily armed people. Canadian tourism, like I said, very big in Cuba. Obviously, they have to fly directly. There is no stopping in the United States if you're going from Canada to Cuba. So this is just a little map. Sorry that it's blurry. I couldn't find a better one. This is just a map that kind of shows you all of the routes into Cuba, and you'll see there's a couple from South America, there's one from Mexico City, and there's a couple from Canada. There are so many Canadians down there and so few Americans that while we were there, everybody just assumed that we were Canadians, and we just kind of let them. It was kind of fun. That unofficial embassy I talked about was at some point converted into a real embassy when these talks really started to heat up in 2016. Okay, so a little bit of background on Cuba. I don't know how much everyone knows about Cuba, but the US invaded Cuba in 1898, and then Cuba gained their independence in 1902. So Cuba became their own country, uncolonized for the first time in a long time, in 1902. And then this man, Fulgencio Batista, was the man who was in charge of Cuba before Fidel Castro. So before Fidel Castro's famous Cuban Revolution and coup, where he and his friends essentially took over, the man Fulgencio Batista was in charge. He was a former soldier, and he was president once completely legitimately. And during his presidency, it was pretty uneventful. He wasn't really remarkable one way or another. He seemed like a normal political leader. And then, after spending some time living in Florida and coming back to Cuba, he decided he wanted to be president again. And this time, when it looked like he was going to lose the election, he just took over in a coup. It was almost like night and day, his first presidency versus his second. And the ironic thing is that at the end of it all, he probably would have won the election legitimately when they actually sat down and looked at the numbers. So you jumped the gun a little bit on the whole coup thing, if you ask me. But the second time around, when Batista was in charge of Cuba, he essentially sold the Cuban economy to the United States, to the US businesses. So what I mean by that is that a lot of Cuba was essentially rented or owned by US businesses for very good deals for those US businesses. They were making bank off of Cuba, and he was making money out of these deals. He was very corrupt. He worked with the US mafia, he had ties to drug lords, and he basically killed anyone who dissented against him. Essentially ran the Cuban economy into the ground. At one point in time, over 70% of the land in Cuba was not being used by Cubans or for Cuba. It was US businesses or other foreign countries that were using that land for factories, plantations, etc. And obviously none of that money was going back into the Cuban economy. So Cuba was in a very bad place money-wise at this point in time. This man also had his own secret police forces. He was essentially every stereotype you could think of about a corrupt government leader was Fulgencio Batista. Now, we did get to take a tour of the Capitol building and the place where he was when he escaped. Spoiler alert, he was run out of the country. I'll talk about that in a second. But we got to see like his office. There's a whole museum that has been made out of the building where he stayed when their first attempts to run him out, where you can still see like the bullet holes in the wall. It's really fascinating. And we toured the Capitol building, where most of the initial failed coups took place, because the Cuban Revolution was not the first attempt to overthrow this man. There were many failed attempts, mostly led by university students from the University of Havana. So when the Cuban Revolution really took hold, and Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and his brother, when they came for Batista, he fled. He knew he was going to be assassinated. He fled the Dominican Republic and eventually settled in Portugal. And when he left, he essentially took all of the money with him. So fast forward to post-Cuban Revolution, Cuba is basically destitute at this point in time. They have no money. Oh, oops, I skipped a picture. Okay, so this is an example to talk a little bit about the whole perspective taking. This was one of the first things we saw when we were in Havana, was this big picture of Fidel Castro, and it says "Vas bien, Fidel," and it just means, you know, it's you're doing well, it's going good, Fidel, you're gonna be fine. And we saw all kinds of images like this everywhere. There were pictures of Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, other Cuban revolutionaries with all this kind of very patriotic language peppered around it. And it was really jarring at first, almost uncomfortable. It was kind of this feeling of like, my God, they really worship this man. That doesn't seem healthy. But then the more we saw it, the more we came to realize just how much of our own lives in the United States we spend seeing stores and schools and signs and everything, you know, named after famous US founders. And I'm not trying to draw a one-to-one comparison between any individual people, just that when you grow up somewhere, you get very used to certain figureheads, certain language, certain people, and it seems normal to you. You know, it might seem completely normal to you to stand up and salute a flag in the morning before school every day. But if you visited a foreign country where you saw, you know, small children doing that, it might feel a little bit weird. So it's just kind of interesting to see that happening in another country and then think about the things that happen in your own. A little bit more about the revolution, just for background's sake. There were a lot of women in the revolution. There were all women platoons, and Castro's private security detail was actually comprised entirely of women. What is up for debate about Fidel Castro is whether or not he was a communist from the start, whether or not it was his intent to, you know, overthrow Batista and instill a communist government, or if that was something that came later. Because initially, the US and Fidel Castro's government were not the enemies that you think of them as today. The US actually recognized Castro's government as legitimate at first, until the third point on this list, when Castro's government began nationalizing all of the US land in Cuba. So they essentially ousted all of the companies that were doing business in Cuba by saying, we need this land for ourselves now, you have to leave. There was no money to offer to like officially reimburse these companies. Whether or not you think that they morally deserved being reimbursed, considering they were essentially taking advantage of the Cuban economy and the Cuban people, is not the point I'm making. But what I'm saying is that there was no money to offer. Don't know whether Castro would have offered money or not, but there was no money to talk about to begin with. So the point is kind of moot. Essentially, the companies got kicked out and they were very upset. The US government was very upset. So very quickly reversed course and said, no, Castro's government is not legitimate. So we're not friends at this point in time. Fast forward, embargo, Bay of Pigs, complete freezing of Cuban assets, and that has begun a long, cold relationship between the US and Cuba. Essentially, the last 50 years have been this sort of standstill of not being willing to work with one another. And it's just another picture of, this one's Che Guevara. Again, these are everywhere, just like these giant looming statues of Cuban revolutionaries. And that one, I believe, says hasta la something. Can't actually read it, but something similar along the lines of the boss there, Bobby and Fidel one. Okay, so if you end up in Cuba, some things to know before you go. Number one, Cuba is humid. Like I mentioned before, I got very sick my first day, even though I was doing everything right. was, sipping like lukewarm, not cold, but like kind of cool water. It was not overdressed. It was not exerting myself, and I still almost passed out. It's so humid there. Even worse than Florida. If you've ever been to Florida, it's like Florida times 10. You should drink only bottled water while you're down there, not even the water they offer you in restaurants, because you may get sick from it. There were a few people in our group that disregarded this rule and they didn't get sick. So probably just depends on, your personal biology, but I wouldn't risk it. You don't want to ruin your time, abroad with, being sick. Cuba is very alive at night. It is not a country that stops moving when the sun goes down. So unlike in the United States, where most of the time, once it gets dark, you're probably not going out and about in the streets. That's not true with Cuba. Everyone is out. It will be midnight and there's dozens of people in the street in front of our hotel, just talking, hanging out, walking around, fishing, playing games. And I'm not going to say that Cuba is safer than the United States, but the atmosphere at night is a little bit different. So there's a bunch of people out. There's also a bunch of police that are out. So maybe every 100 yards or so, there's just a police officer standing on the street there. So if that makes you feel safe, then being out at night in Cuba is probably no more dangerous than being out during the day. Whereas here in the United States, if I were living in Seattle, I probably wouldn't go walking around streets at night in Seattle or Portland or New York or any place where there's a lot of people. But if you're going to do it in Cuba, if you're going to do it anywhere. One of the more uncomfortable aspects about going to Cuba as a foreigner is that you will receive better treatment, which is, on the one hand, it's good, but on the other hand, it did make us feel very uncomfortable and very guilty. One of the first things they told us when we got there was not to worry because they have a secret, better hospital for foreigners. So people who are visiting Cuba don't have to go to a Cuban hospital if they need medical care. The embargo or blockade that I talked about earlier, one of the things that is affected by that is medical supplies. So while Havana does have like medical school and there are great doctors in Cuba, a lot of them are limited by the supplies they can get their hands on. So for example, you are not allowed to, say, sell a manufactured drug, a vaccine, a medicine, whatever, to Cuba if a certain percentage of that medicine is patented to like a US company, because the US would consider that to be a violation of their embargo. Some really simple materials, even like suture material for surgeries, very hard to get a hold of. One of the gentlemen that we spoke to, he was actually our tour guide, and told us stories about how when his daughter needed a surgery, he had to actually get special permission from the government to leave to go to Canada for a vacation. But while he was in Canada, he had to buy suture material and bring it back to Cuba to give to the doctor. So it's not that they don't have good doctors in Cuba, but they do not have the same resources or supplies that you might find elsewhere. Another thing about Cuba is it is one of those countries where you do have to worry about being ripped off money-wise. Obviously, if you go to one of their night markets and you're haggling with people, it's to be expected that you're gonna end up, paying whatever you end up paying. But do be aware that legitimate businesses in Cuba will try to steal your money. So like one of the ones for us was a convenience store. We went in to buy bottled water. And they tried to charge us triple what the actual price was, even though we could see the price on the label very clearly. And I think that's something that a lot of people aren't expecting. Everyone's expecting, out in the street at some market that, maybe they're going to try to charge you extra. But most of us were not expecting to be lied to, going down the stuff going down the conveyor belt, getting rung up at a cash register in what's essentially a Cuban 7-Eleven. But that will happen. So just be aware of that. All of the businesses in Cuba are separate. There are private businesses and there are government-owned ones. And you're less likely to be ripped off at the government-owned ones, but it is really hard to tell. It's not like there's a big sign out front that says this store is run by the Cuban government or this store is private. You kind of just have to rely on people to tell you what is what. And then this is a picture of a beautiful peacock. They're everywhere in Cuba, and they will attack you if you get too close to their friends. I got too close to one of the girl peahens once, and a male peacock just came out of a tree and just charged me. It's terrifying, but they are very pretty. This is my favorite part. Fuster's is an art boutique in Cuba. So if you can kind of see in this picture, the bottle on the very, very far right, that dark blue one is the one that I ended up actually buying. I don't know if you can see my camera or not, but I have my bottle right here. It almost didn't make it back from Cuba. The people at the airport were convinced that it was still full of liquids. They almost didn't let me take it on the flight. Prior to 2015, there had been a law that stated that you could take no souvenirs home from Cuba if you managed to get there at all. Absolutely none. And so everybody who went on this study abroad before my class did essentially had to lie and smuggle all their souvenirs back. By the time we went in 2015, that Cuban thaw that I talked about was in full effect and the law had changed. And now it was that you could bring back as many, trinket souvenirs as you wanted. So my bottle, totally fine. The only limitation was on liquor and cigars. So you could bring back up to $100 worth combined of liquor and tobacco products. So we weren't allowed to bring back too many cigars or too much rum. Obviously, you don't have to provide receipts or anything. They don't really know exactly how much you spent on everything, but you still have to keep it within reason or they will take it from you. They will not let you leave with it. But back to Fuster's. Fuster is the name of a gentleman who has been doing art in Cuba for his entire life. And he essentially has tiled artwork. You can see those four-sided tiles down there. And what he does is he picks a house in the neighborhood that he lives in, and he just does tile art all over that house, the street, the sidewalk, everything. It's really beautiful. I think I have a picture next. Yes, so this is what it looks like. So this is the outside of the building, and he does this kind of art all over the entire city. So it's part decoration, but it's also part rebuilding. So this small fishing town of Geminitas, which is on the outskirts of Havana, where Fuster lives, is kind of in shambles. It's a kind of a falling apart in a lot of places. And so this is part of his effort to kind of rev up the city that he lives in. He does this all for free for the people. He doesn't charge them for this. He's done over 80 houses with these just really ornate murals and domes, and they're all tailor-made to those specific neighbors. So this man is really the most famous artist currently living in Cuba, and we got to meet him and we got to buy some of his products, and that was a lot of fun. So definitely go to Fuster's if you ever make it into Cuba. This is a panoramic view of a small section of the neighborhood that he lived in. This is actually the main section where if you keep walking forward, you will run into his actual workshop where you can buy things and you can watch him make his art. Okay, Cuban cars. So Cuba, pretty well known for classic cars, right? We were there right around the time the Cuban government was lifting one of its restrictions. So prior to 2015, it was not allowed for just regular people to buy a car in Cuba. Only certain people had permission to buy cars. You had to be a doctor or part of the military or part of the government to be able to buy a car, or to sell a car. And that restriction was lifted. So there were a lot of celebrations going on in the streets when we were there. Unfortunately, even though the purchasing restrictions were lifted, cars are still way too expensive for most people that live in Cuba. They're more expensive in Cuba than they are in the United States. And that makes a little bit of sense. It is an island. There's no car manufacturing plants in Cuba to make the cars. So they do have to import them, and that's always going to be a little bit more expensive. But just one example I put down here, a Kia Rio, which would sell for 13 grand over here, is going to be over $40,000 in Cuba. And that's just a prohibitively expensive amount of money for most people. So even though it's technically legal for people to buy and sell cars all they want in Cuba now, the reality of it is that still only very rich, very, very privileged people have access to the kind of funds to allow them to buy a car. The taxis in Cuba, some of them are these classic cars. This is a picture of a taxi right here, this 1950s looking car. It's a lot of fun, but they are terrifying. I think that we were afraid for our lives in every single taxi we rode in down there. The street rules in Cuba are a little bit different. there are no crosswalks and they do not stop for pedestrians. So crossing the street can be almost impossible at times. And the taxis themselves, some of them are really nice. This particular photo here is of a really nice one, but a lot of the taxis are dangerous. One evening when we were coming back from a boxing match that we had watched, we had to get one of the late night cabs, which was a very cheap one that was kind of falling apart. It was so broken that the back seat was no longer attached properly to the car. And so every time the driver stopped and hit his brakes, the entire back seat would lurch forward and we'd have to throw our arms out and catch ourselves against the front seats to keep from hitting our heads. So not a car you want to be in if there's going to be a car accident. Okay, again, restaurants, just like everything else, there's private sector and there's state-run restaurants in Cuba. If you go to Cuba, I would recommend going with a guide. We were very lucky that our class was a guided class by a man from Cuba, and he was able to kind of warn us like where to go and where not to go. And as long as he was with us, you know, we did not get taken advantage of. But if you do find yourself, like we did once, accidentally in a private sector restaurant, they will probably try to overcharge you. With the restaurant we went to, they gave us what is conservatively called a tourist menu. So it's the same menu as everyone else, except all the prices are like quadruple what they should be. And it was just really funny because we all knew what they were doing, but they like wouldn't admit to it, even though we were saying it to their face, because there's this group of 15 of us and they bring us one menu to share. And they're like, this is the only menu we have, as other waiters are walking around with stacks of menus in their aprons. And we're like, okay, but you know, that man has menus over there. Can we have one? And they would just say, nope, that's the only menu we have. I'm like, okay, this menu is overpriced, isn't it? And it was. They charged me like $20 for a hamburger and fries. And when they brought that plate out, it had 4 French fries on it. I was like, this is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So you have to be kind of careful of that. Cuban sandwiches and Cuba Libres everywhere, delicious, recommend them. But do listen to your guide if you go. If your guide says, go to this restaurant, not this restaurant, listen to them. Because Cuban restaurants that are in the private sector, they might try to take advantage of you. Also, when you go to a restaurant, be prepared to be on what is known as Cuban time. The United States is a very time sensitive country, maybe not so much as like some places in Asia where if you're a minute late you're in trouble, but in the United States we still do kind of value time as like a commodity to be spent or lost or earned. In Cuba they're very lax about time. It would take 4.5 hours to get in and out of a restaurant. It's not a country where you want to just pop in for a quick lunch somewhere, because you'll go in, you'll sit down, and 25 minutes will go by before somebody even offers you water. And then they scamper away before you can even, you know, get a drink order in, and they come back 20 minutes later to take the drink order. And you're like, I'm ready to order food too. And they run off. And, you know, 40 minutes goes by and they finally come back to get you your food order. And that's just kind of how it is down there. They're expecting you to lounge and relax for a long time, which we were not used to. Oh no, too fast. Okay, so this was a restaurant called La Bodeguita, which was a favorite of Ernest Hemingway. Sorry, brain fade. Ernest Hemingway is a Cuban cultural icon, despite not being Cuban. Very, very attached to that country. A lot of people, the first thing they think of when they think of Cuba, after Fidel Castro, is you know, the author of The Old Man and the Sea. So this place, La Bodeguita, you can sign your name there. They actually encourage you to. I promise, I was told that I was allowed to sign my name on this building. This is what it looks like behind our table. This is kind of what it looked like. Everyone signs their names there. A lot of fun. This is a museum restaurant we stayed in. That's Cuban coffee. We actually ended up staying for a while in a very small eco town that was nothing but coffee. That was like their whole thing was that they made coffee. It's delicious. So Cuban coffee is also very, very good. Oh, I missed a picture. Okay, this is my favorite picture of food in Cuba. They don't devein their shrimp and they don't de-eyeball their shrimp before you eat it. So if you get seafood in Cuba, it's one of those countries where you need to be prepared to have your food looking back at you. And I was not prepared, so that shrimp kind of shook me. I did not end up eating it. I have trouble eating things that still have eyes. So about Ernest Hemingway, we actually got to visit his house. So Ernest Hemingway used to be a journalist, ended up being a novelist, basically moved to Cuba forever. He was in love with Cuba. He lived in Cuba. His house full of like big game hunting, trophy skulls and stuff on his walls, essentially. And strangely enough, a graveyard. This is a picture of the graveyard of either his dogs or his cats. I don't remember which. He had two. There's also an entire boat at his house, and it's all a tourist location now. But we went to some of Ernest Hemingway's favorite haunts. You can actually go to this hotel, which is called the Hotel Ambos Mundos, so hotel of like both worlds. That's what that means. And that is where he did a lot of his writing. And they have like his room that he would always stay in, where you can go and you can like see the view down to the street and be like, oh, Ernest Hemingway looked out the same window when he wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls. So if you're an Ernest Hemingway fan, Cuba is the place to go. Okay, now at last we've gotten to the part about the actual class. So the press in Cuba. So Cuba is a communist-controlled country, at least from US perspective. Cuba does not call themselves communists, they call themselves failed socialists, essentially. At least that's what the people in the street will tell you, is that they never truly achieved what their communist ideals actually were. And they're well aware of that. The people in Cuba know that things aren't going great. So the press in Cuba is heavily controlled. The Granma is the main newspaper and it's published by the Communist Party. So the way media works in Cuba is that there is more than one. There's more than one newspaper, there's more than one radio station, there's more than one, every news outlet, but each one is run by a political party. There are none that are even claiming to be independent because it's not allowed. And when I say run by different political parties, I mean different sections, like different subgroups of the main Communist Party. It's not like there's this newspaper that's run by the Communist Party and this newspaper that's run by the, Socialist Party or the Capitalist Party or anything like that. It's all like, this one's run by the Communist Party, this one's run by the Communist Youth Party, this one's run by this other subset of the Communist Party. So nothing really gets to be published without permission from the government. There are very strict propaganda laws. And you don't get to just say, you could try, but it is not advised to say anything mean about the Cuban government. So the government doesn't officially publish like the radio or print news, but it does approve it, which is one of the main reasons why we were a journalism class that went down there. It was to study the difference between journalism in the United States and journalism in a country like Cuba, where it is very closely controlled by the US government. The Granma newspaper that we visited, it was a very different experience, the newspaper versus the radio station, because the newspaper is run by several Cuban citizens. And the Cuban man who was like in charge of it, he talked to us and he was pretty much aware of the limitations on his ability to report, and he didn't really pull any punches talking about it. He was very open about wanting to not have to get approval from the government in order to publish things. However, when we went to the radio station, the news radio station, that one was owned run by not a Cuban man, but a man from Canada who had moved to Cuba. And he was very, very much more so on board with the entire structure and the entire system. So even within the Cuban press, we got to meet a lot of different perspectives. And it was startling how many of those were from people who had essentially defected to Cuba from wherever they used to live. This man from Canada hadn't been back to Canada in 35 years and had no intention of ever going back, and was a huge fan of the Cuban government, almost to the point where it got a little bit uncomfortable. He did spend a good deal of time trying to convince us that certain bad things in Cuba did not exist. For example, he insisted that there was no such thing as racism in Cuba. And someone in our class rightfully pointed out that Cuba is a country that was colonized by another country. And really, how could it even be possible for there to not be racial tension in a country that's like post-colonization? But he was insistent that there's no racism in Cuba, not now, not ever. It's not allowed. So we kind of just had to smile and nod because of course there's racism in Cuba. There is racism everywhere. But it was just a little bit abrupt to see, especially someone who wasn't Cuban, who had decided to take on this role of like propagating the Communist Party. This is just a mural that's up in the main newspaper, the Granma. This is a mural of different musicians and different people that they interviewed. Okay, so traveling to Cuba today. Despite the thawing of the restrictions during the last few years of Barack Obama's presidency, Donald Trump went in kind of the opposite direction. Most of that has either stalled or been full-on reversed. So we don't have like the booming tourist trade that we thought we were going to have with Cuba. Obviously, Fidel Castro is no longer, he was alive when we went down there, but you know, he and his brother are no longer in charge of the country. So things are changing, but not necessarily in the direction that we all thought they were going to. Travel is more heavily restricted now than it was 5 years ago, but it has not been completely prohibited. I'm not gonna say it's impossible to get to Cuba. You can get there, especially if you have family or if you are in some way connected to Cuba. It's very easy to get on a charter plane. But for just a US citizen who's not connected to Cuba in any way, they really don't want you to go. It's possible, but it's going to be difficult to get down there. The embassies in Washington, D.C. and the special interest section, that is also technically kind of an embassy now, in Havana are still open. They're still open last time I checked. So that's a good sign. So maybe things will progress after all. And this is just one last picture of the hotel that we stayed at. Again, Cuba is gorgeous by night. So if you ever get the chance to go there, I would highly recommend it.
Thank you, Jackie. That was, yeah, I love that. I really genuinely love that. I think this particular speaker series is, yeah, it's unique among the few that we've had already, and especially I think going forward the next few, it's something that obviously, you know, you have the benefit of not many people have traveled there, so it makes for, you know, a really interesting story. And yeah. So I guess I have one question. You know, to me, when I was listening to you, there's definitely a lot of perspective taken, but also I feel like this totally touches on a lot of global system things as well. You know, the embargoes, the blockades, and yeah. So I'm just wondering how far does kind of the sphere of kind of the global system, the international governmental relationships, how far does that extend? You talked a lot about the United States and Cuba and maybe some more of the other Caribbean countries. And if another country tries to make a deal with Cuba, then, you know, the US judges them or takes action. So anyway, how big, like, are European countries also involved in this, or other continents?
Pretty much like a case-by-case basis. The US has in the past imposed sanctions on other countries. So it kind of depends on like what the US's relationship with that country to start with is. If it's a country that the US doesn't have a lot of dealings with, then they can probably do whatever they want with Cuba, because there's no threat from the US that they're going to take seriously. But no major global trading partner would do too much with Cuba. Obviously, Canada sends tourists down there. Like they can't completely stop every country in the world from doing anything with Cuba. But if you want to be on friendly trading terms with the United States, it is not advised to enter into any sort of deals with Cuba.
And So you went for a study abroad specifically to learn about their media landscape.
Yes, so we went for, it was a journalism class. I can't remember the name of it, but basically we went down there and we studied, we went to their newspaper, their hospitals, their radio stations, and we found stories to publish down there. The story that I did was on a gentleman who had been involved in the Cuban Revolution, and then after the revolution had started working in a cigar factory, and he worked there every day of his life for the next, 60 years. So that was my kind of like feature interest piece story that I did. Other students did stories on, more specifically on like the newspaper itself, or we ran into some people who were related to a group in Cuba called the White Dames, and they're a group of women whose children have been imprisoned for like political dissent in Cuba. And so we got to interview some of them, very, very much on case of anonymity. They did not want to be named for obvious reasons, but some people did stories on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think one girl did a
So
story
it
on
was
the
difficult to
hospital
get. So it was difficult to go there, at the time that you went to, but it was still opening up. And you're saying that now travel still is prohibited, but or it's not prohibited, but it's more difficult. So I guess what do you could another trip happen again anytime soon? I guess there's an election around the corner. That also will change things.
That
But
will very much affect it. I think the trip that I went on was the last of this. WSU went every year for a few years, and then after our trip, they did not go the next year, and I don't think they went any of the years after that. They took it to a different country instead. I haven't looked in like the last year or so to see if maybe it's been put back on the docket, but I don't believe that WSU has gone since I went. And I have to assume that it's not impossible, but it's probably much more difficult right now. I'd imagine you would need to reapply for permission and get much more paperwork filled out.
well, thank you so much. And yeah, I hope that a lot of people get a lot of good perspectives and ideas from watching this. Thank you.